Okay, now as we enter what we call the modern era, beginning in Europe, maybe 16th, 17th century, this framework of a traditional culture starts to become unraveled. Perhaps the distinctive feature of the modern stage of culture is the intensified sense of individuality. So with the birth of the modern era, the individual comes to recognize himself or herself as a distinct individual who has the capacity through their personal will to reshape and change the world. And so the arising of the modern era brings this great sense of personal power and capacity. It begins perhaps with critical thought, the ability to criticize tradition, to find the flaws in tradition, and then to envisage new possibilities, and through the affirmation of the will, through the application of the will, one sets out to transform one's society and the world. So on the one hand, modern culture brings a sense of strength and capacity to the individual, but it has another effect. That is, it disconnects the individual from the wider network of relations in which the person had been embedded in a traditional culture. And once, I'm afraid this is sounding a little bit like an academic university lecture, but let me just go on. Okay, but once the individual gets torn out from that web of family and community relationships, along with the increased sense of power and capacity, comes an increasing sense of loneliness, alienation, and isolation. There also comes, again, this is through the development of modern science, a reduction of the world to the lowest common denominator, that reality consists of just impersonal, cold particles of matter reeling through space in accordance with the laws of Newtonian physics, combining into different combinations, and everything else is just a superstructure built upon this foundation of brute, senseless, unintelligent matter. And so this brings a collapse, at least amongst certain very sensitive thinkers, a collapse of all of those structures that gave a sense of transcendent meaning and value to life. Life becomes seen as empty, meaningless, just a field of competition between individuals with no higher purpose. And so to avoid the despair that sense of meaningless might entail, there comes the distractions in the form of obsession with power, money, influence, sexual enjoyment. And the development of more powerful, constant innovation. Within each generation, again, almost every year, there has to be new models, new machines, new technologies to replace those of a few years ago, which have now become obsolete. So this constant obsession with progress and development. Okay, now there are certain virtues which are characteristic of the modern era, the modern mind. The virtues that are emphasized are, let us say, independence, both independence of will, independence of thought. Nobody's going to tell me what to think. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Whatever I want to do, that I'm going to do. Whatever I want to think, that I'm going to think. So independence, diligence, the eagerness to work hard in order to and ideas into reality. Foresight, the ability to see new possibilities for the future. Prudence, it's calculation of how to best serve one's self-interest. And then a special quality that's emphasized is domination. So the modern era becomes the era of nations vying, competing with one another to dominate the world. And as a consequence of this, we have increasing militarism. And through the use of technology, the development of new weapons, new instruments of asserting one's power and attempting to dominate the world and bend the world according to the will of one's own nation, which generally means the will of those in the elite, the very small elite of that nation. Okay, now that is the modern stage of cultural development. And now the third stage is what I call the postmodern stage. And for this stage, we have to my knowledge, no society which yet fully exemplifies the particular modalities of this stage. But we could see certain cultural developments which are distinctive of an emerging, a nascent and growing postmodern consciousness. And this postmodern stage, I would say, develops, perhaps it started to begin, I mean, I'm a child of the 1960s, so I like to believe that it began 1966, 1967, that particular period. But perhaps its roots go back even to the 1920s, the post-World War I period. It begins with a reaction against the reductionism, the materialism, and individualism of the modernist consciousness. And in place of this reductionist and materialist mode of understanding, the postmodern mind emphasizes a holistic and even a spiritual understanding of the world. Within the postmodern frame of thought, there comes maybe a reaction against the forms of religion that dominate in traditional culture and then continue in the modern era. In the modern era, religion also becomes affected by this urge for domination. So we have massive organized religions sending their representatives to other countries to convert the populations to their form of religion, and the natives of the countries affected react by asserting their religion against the religion of the invaders. So we have this religious conflict. Now what happens in the modern stage is not an abandoning of religious consciousness, but what I would call a transformation of the religious consciousness from that of the sense of personal identity, identifying oneself with one's religion, into a spirituality, a spiritual type of consciousness which emphasizes participation and experience rather than belonging, control, and domination.